I've made hundreds of mind maps, and as a learning coach for the past few years, I've worked with thousands of students using this exact note-taking approach. And I've realized that mind maps are one of the most powerful tools for studying, and they genuinely allow you to learn anything so fast that it feels illegal, but that's only when they're used correctly. So in this video, I'm going to break down how to make the perfect mind map into a simple to follow 6-step checklist. And I'll also be creating a mind map as a live demo so you'll know exactly what to do. Let's get started with step number 1, which is to rewire your brain. The reason why the mind map method is so effective is that it leverages what research calls higher order learning. And so this is a form of learning that allows you to gain much deeper mastery and understanding of everything that you're learning. And as a result, you are able to perform much better on your final exams. There are many misconceptions about mind maps. People say things like mind maps don't work or that they'll make you slow. But in my experience as a learning coach, I've never seen a student who has actually used mind maps correctly and then still go ahead and say that they didn't work. And so it may feel hard and frustrating, and you might feel like it's not working for you or that you're wasting time, but that's not because of you. It is just because you're unfamiliar with the method. You haven't learned it well enough to gain the benefits just yet. And so the main reason people struggle is that they misunderstand what mind maps are for. So here are the key mindset shifts that you need to make. Number 1 is to realize that a mind map is just one tool in your toolbox. Its purpose is to help you see the big picture and understand how the main concepts connect with each other. Number 2, it's not actually for memorizing details. That's what you want to rely on other mnemonic methods for, or something like flashcards. And for 3, it's about knowing that an effective study system starts with a mind map to help you grasp the main pillars and the connections between the certain ideas that you're learning. And then for some of the more important but smaller details, you do want to handle that separately and leave the tiny low yield stuff, again, for flashcards. So it's about knowing that you need a system, and mind map is just one of those tools. So here's the key insight. If you want to reduce how many flashcards you rely on and need all of the time and actually avoid rote memorization, then that comes down to how good your mind map is in the first place. So with that said, let's start creating our mind map with step number 2. So step number 2 is smart skimming. The reason a mind map helps you learn faster is because we begin by starting with a broad but summarized overview of the thing that we're learning. So you want to think about it more like this, which is, if you were to imagine a thin layer of water spread across a table versus having a deep column of water in a measuring cylinder. What we're aiming for here is that thin layer, that broad overview. So smart skimming means looking over your key resources, your lectures, your textbooks, YouTube videos, and picking out a list of keywords to use in your mind map. And so I recommend that you focus on the high yield resources. So for something like medicine, this might be looking at YouTube videos from Ninja Nerd or Amboss or maybe Osmosis, or basically you can go out there to other students who have been there before you and then just ask them what resources they have found particularly useful. And so you don't need a lot of keywords here. You only really need around 20, but you just want to get the most important concepts for the topic. Now, you want to make sure that you're not spending more than 5 to 10 minutes on this step. And I know that it may feel like scary, that you're missing all of the details and leaving them for later, but we just need to remember that step 1 is about rewiring our brains to not just worry about all of that detail just yet, knowing that we will get there at a certain point in time. So these later steps, they are going to make sure that nothing important gets missed. So a tip for this stage is that you can use something like ChatGPT to type up a prompt and do something like this. For example, for the topic of cardiology, give me 20 key words, including key concepts. And then if I just type that in, ChatGPT is going to basically give me a pretty good answer of what we could start off with that summarizes what this topic is about. So we can see that we've got a list here: cardiac output, stroke volume, heart rate, preload, afterload, ischemia, atherosclerosis, MI. And this is a pretty good place to start. And so once we've got our keywords, we're ready for step 3. Step 3 is deliberate inquiry. This is where it's time to start engaging in higher order learning by asking questions and exploring the significance and relationships between the keywords that we found. And after many years studying learning science and being coached by Dr. Justin Sung, I found that these are the most powerful questions to go ahead and ask, which is, why is it important and how is it related? So here is how that plays out. If I select my first keyword, let's say it's cardiac output, I can ask, why is cardiac output? And then how is this related to maybe stroke volume? And I may not know what cardiac output and stroke volume are, and you may have never seen these words, but if you think about it carefully, you might try and get a good hypothesis of what it is. So for example, cardiac output is an output, an outcome, and stroke volume is probably related to cardiac output, but specifically focusing on the volume that is released. And then I could go to ChatGPT or Google or to any other resource and quickly get a definition of what cardiac output and stroke volume are. But the key focus here is that when I'm looking at the definition, I am not trying to memorize the definition. I'm trying to understand it just enough so that I can find that relationship to the other keyword that I'm looking at. And so I may realize that cardiac output is important because this helps us understand how efficient and effective the heart is working. If there is no cardiac output, then we're going to be in trouble because there is not enough oxygen getting around to the body. And so I quickly learned that stroke volume is how much blood is pumping out of the heart for every single pump that there is. So stroke volume is very correlated to cardiac output. So that helps me understand, firstly, why it's important and how they are related. Now, you can go levels very deep on this. And again, that's good. And you don't want to go the entire way. You just want to have enough to relate it first at this point. And we'll come back to this a little bit later in one of the later steps. And so we can continue this process going down the list. So next is heart rate. And I may, again, think that that's related to cardiac output based on just intuition, then I might dive into it a little bit more and then realize that heart rate and stroke volume, they work together to create your cardiac output. And then instead of just taking that as a definition, I again want to understand why it is the case and how they are related. So stroke volume is, again, how much you're getting out of every single pump. And then the heart rate is looking at how many pumps are done per minute. And once you've thought about this and you've looked at some of the resources, you can also use ChatGPT as an aid here. So I might even say, like, why is cardiac output important in context of medicine? So coming back to the idea that I had talked about before, cardiac output is helping us understand how the heart is performing its core function of delivering oxygenated blood to tissues to meet the metabolic demand. And you can start going down a rabbit hole if you wanted. You could say, well, why is oxygenated blood important to allow the body to meet its metabolic demands? And then you realize, well, now we have cellular respiration and oxygen is needed for that. And we can read more about what ChatGPT says here to understand different perspectives of why cardiac output is important. And again, all of these perspectives are important to at least consider. That is the whole point of learning. We learn things from many different perspectives and we look at how all of them are related. And this may seem overwhelming at first, but this is what we are ultimately trying to do with any form of learning that we're looking at. The reality is that we're being confronted with that right up front and we can deal with that. So if anything, we are more empowered to learn the information that is in front of us. So if we go back to the keyword list here, we can start to see a little bit more. Now we got the Frank-Starling mechanism. And let's say at this point, I don't really know why that's important and how it relates to the other things here. Again, I can quickly search up what is Frank-Starling mechanism and then quickly try and connect it to the other ideas. But let's say that I've already tried that myself and I need the answer, then I can ask ChatGPT. So make sure to not ask ChatGPT first. You need to first think about it. And this is called the generative effect. So how is Frank-Starling mechanism related to cardiac output and why is it important? And so we can see here that the Frank-Starling mechanism is related to self-regulating cardiac output through venous return. And I might realize at this point, this is a bit too much for me. I don't even know what venous return is. And there's words of preload mentioned here, myosin, actin, like this is too much. Then I just move on to another keyword. And then this will make more sense a little bit later once I've learned a little bit more. So we go through the keywords and we repeat this process multiple times. But while you're doing this, you're gonna want a way to document this. And that's what naturally brings us to step number 4. Step number 4 is mapping connections. So this is where we bring out a pen and paper, an iPad if you will, and start to map this out. So we want to start mapping out those connections that we were starting to see now. So we had cardiac output, and we know that that was related to heart rate and stroke volume. It is made up of these two things. So the arrow here can represent whatever we would like it to. In some cases, it might mean a cause and effect. This leads to that. Or it might be saying that concept is made up of some other concepts. For example, what we've done here. And as we can see on ChatGPT, we can see that cardiac output and stroke volume, they were related to the Frank-Starling mechanism through a form of auto-regulation. So I've put a little bit out here and just kind of gone with the instructions that I've given you, which is just, I want to put these keywords together and connect them in some way. But what you realize is that if you're doing this without taking a step backwards, you might run into a situation like this, where you've just got like a line of thought happening, and then you kind of have these three ideas and you're like, wait, hey, none of this actually fits with everything else that's going on here. And so it brings up an important point, which is that when you do it in this process alone, it can get quite messy, which is why we need step number 5 to be thinking about all of the time so that we can ensure that the mind map doesn't progress into this messy thing where you just aren't actually going to get any value from it. Step number 5 is importance-based chunking. Chunking means grouping similar or related concepts under a shared heading. And yes, you could technically group things together based on something arbitrary like alphabetical order, but that's not going to help you with the intention of why you created this mind map in the first place and with your understanding. What we want is importance-based chunking, which means grouping your keywords together based on how that keyword concept is meaningful and how it relates to the other words around it. So to do this well, we have to ask ourselves a few things. We're asking ourselves, how do these keywords relate to one another? What are their similarities and differences? And what is the best way to show how these keywords support the overall purpose of this mind map topic? Once we're able to do that, your mind map will start to become clearer, more organized, and actually useful. You'll be able to teach this to someone and use this knowledge in tests or exams. So let's go back and give this a go with the mind map that we have. So I've asked myself, with all these keywords that I do have here, why is the cardiovascular system itself and cardiology important? That is the entire topic. And I'm thinking again also how cardiac output and some of these ideas relate into that. And the whole point is that we're trying to deliver an essential need of oxygen to parts of the body while also taking away the waste products. The circulatory system is allowing us to have this kind of highway of transporting these good things and bad things. So that's a key idea. That is why this whole entire thing is important. And I'm gonna have that as one of my importance-based chunks. So I'm gonna call this transport, and I'm gonna break that down into nutrients and waste. Now, one of these nutrients is of course oxygen, okay? Waste could be your CO2, and I might remove these details later because it might be quite obvious. And looking at some of these other concepts, well, what else would like to have in my backbone? Well, that would be actually this idea of a conduction system. In other words, I might be able to simplify this down to kind of think about it as the electricity or the power. So I might just write down that word to help me memorize this. And this idea of the conduction system and the transport, if they are working together, the heart is pumping, we kind of get this idea of cardiac output again. So at this level, the keywords are starting to fit together in this way. So I take a look back at some of the keywords that we've got here. Frank-Starling mechanism, still not quite there yet. Preload, afterload, ejection fraction. ECG is an easy one to put into here. I know it will be somewhere around here when we start looking at the conduction system. I do see a whole other bunch of keywords here that I would describe as the pathologies. You know, you've got your heart failure, myocardial ischemia. So that's kind of when things are not working well, and it's important to know how things work when they're working well, and then you can better identify how something may be wrong, which is the pathology. So how can I fit the pathology into the backbone that I have here? What I may want to do is just incorporate those ideas when it comes to one of these key ideas later on. So I'm going to go ahead and add some more keywords onto here and use a little bit of ChatGPT help as well, answering those questions of why is it important and how does it relate. So again, I might have my key idea of heart rate being a little bit closer to the conduction system.
and also stroke volume. And I have learned a little bit more about how the stroke volume is actually really closely related to preload and afterload. Afterload being the resistance that you have to go against to be able to make that pump, and then preload is what's coming in before. Now, what I find out is, through my understanding, heart failure is very closely related to preload and stroke volume impacts. Cardiac failure, and if I really wanted to, I could relate it back to heart rate and look into that relationship that exists there, which is compensatory in a way. But I'll keep it a little bit simple for now. But again, you could break down that cardiac and failure more into the two different types if you wanted to. Now, if I'm looking at the ECG, I know that it relates to the conduction system here, right? And I could just connect it like this, but that isn't, again, doing the importance-based chunking. I want to think about, okay, well, when I'm looking at the ECG, that's related to some other keywords here, SA node, AV node, some of the anatomy. We know that the conduction system is what leads to the heart pumping itself and the heart rate. So, technically you could draw that arrow, but again, I think that's pretty well described by it being related to cardiac output. That's just a choice that I am making. And so I see ANS, it's also here. I want to be able to encapsulate the importance of the ECG and some of the other keywords that I know that are going to exist under there. So to keep things different, I can think about, well, why is an ECG important? One of the key things that ECGs help us out with is that it helps us detect if that there are problems. So I might use the word detection and then put underneath that ECGs, knowing that ECGs is related to basically everything else in this diagram here, but its main purpose is detection. And especially, again, we could look at the relationship of how ECGs can help you identify cardiac failure. You can see that there's going to be a ton of relationships that are occurring, but I am focusing on why this key thing is important. And that is what will be demonstrated on my Mindmap. So you can see there are many ways that all of these ideas can connect. But what I've got going on here is the ECG is really, its core purpose is that it's going to help us detect everything that's going on to do with the cardiovascular system, and that's why I chose that one. I can end up continuing to refine this mind map, going back to ChatGPT, my resources, asking more inquiry questions about it, and then adjusting this mind map to make it a little bit cleaner, a little bit more organized, and actually include more of these keywords while keeping some of the smaller details, like for example, ejection fraction, to maybe not even be on this mind map because it is obvious enough once you look at how that relates to some of the key concepts here. And maybe I put that on a flashcard if I really want to. But again, my focus here is on conceptual understanding and developing that knowledge, schema, and framework of how all of this works together. And so all of this brings us to step number 6, which is the recursive cycle. Here's how this one works. You're going from the keywords to inquiry, to mapping it, and then you're going to the chunking. And then you add more keywords and you repeat this cycle again and again. Technically, I've been doing this as I've been showing you this. But the point is that I wanted to make this a point because this is something that you want to expect. You're not gonna get it right on your first try. And that's how learning works. You will never get it right on your first try. If you just write down the information onto your notebook, thinking that you've got everything, the reality is you know you don't. So we want to continuously go back to refine our understanding, and that's why we keep going backwards and forwards until we start to realize that the mind map itself is starting to consolidate and it's not changing as much anymore. That's when we realize that we're reaching like a plateau and that we may actually be starting to get that full understanding now. And so you should expect that you will do something and then you'll have to start again, you'll re-chunk it, you'll refine, and that is not failure, that is not a bad thing. That's actually a sign that you're doing this process and mind mapping right. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you want to see more of this, please let me know in the comments of what you would like to see. And until next time, I'll catch you in the next one.